Was Tartaria the greatest civilization wiped from human history? In maps from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, a vast territory stretches across northern and central Asia, labeled with a name that appears repeatedly, Tartaria or Tartary. The region is shown as enormous, sometimes extending from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing lands that modern atlases divide among Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and China. Historical texts mention Tartary casually as a known geographic designation, describing its people, its trade routes, and its boundaries as if the territory were as real and established as France or Spain. Yet today, this name has essentially vanished from common usage, surviving only in academic discussions of obsolete geographic terminology and in alternative history communities, convinced that something far stranger than simple renaming occurred. According to mainstream history, Tartaria was never a unified civilization or empire. It was merely a catch-all term used by European cartographers to designate the vast, poorly understood regions of Central Asia inhabited by various Turkic and Mongol peoples, a geographic label that fell out of use as European knowledge of Asian geography improved and as specific nations and territories were more accurately mapped. But proponents of an alternative narrative argue that this explanation is incomplete, that it fails to account for architectural anomalies, technological inconsistencies, and historical gaps that suggest Tartaria was not just a cartographic convenience, but an actual advanced civilization, whose existence was systematically erased from official history. They point to buildings worldwide, ornate structures featuring classical architecture, advanced engineering, and inexplicable construction dates that seem too sophisticated for the periods and locations attributed to them. They reference photographs from the 19th and early 20th centuries, showing cities with infrastructure that appears more developed than conventional timelines allow. They cite maps depicting Tartaria as a specific political entity with defined borders and capital cities, not just a vague geographic region. And they ask uncomfortable questions about why such a prominent feature of historical maps and texts should disappear so completely from modern consciousness, why entire buildings from the 1800s should be demolished within decades of construction, and why mainstream history seems so determined to dismiss inquiries into Tartaria as conspiracy theory, rather than engaging with the evidence presented. Tonight, we examine the claims made by Tartaria researchers, the evidence they cite for a lost advanced civilization, and the mainstream historical explanations that categorize Tartaria as geographic terminology rather than civilizational reality. We explore the maps that showed a vast territory, the buildings that seem architecturally anachronistic, the photographs that raise questions about technological timelines, and the fundamental disagreement about whether history is accurately recorded or systematically revised. This is, was Tartaria the greatest civilization wiped from human history? The maps that remember. The strongest documentary evidence that something called Tartaria existed comes from cartographic sources spanning several centuries. These are not obscure or dubious maps from unreliable sources, but rather works produced by the most respected cartographers of their eras, maps that were used for navigation, trade, and diplomatic purposes, maps whose accuracy in depicting other regions is generally accepted by modern historians. The 1570 Atlas by Abraham Ortelius, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, considered the first modern atlas, shows Tartaria as a vast region in Asia. The 1594 map by Gerardus Mercator, whose projection system is still used today, depicts Tartaria with considerable detail, showing cities, mountains, and political boundaries. Maps from the 17th century by Johannes Blay, Nicholas Sanson, and other prominent cartographers consistently show Tartaria, often divided into subcategories: independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, suggesting not just a geographic region, but political divisions within a larger territory. The 1771 Encyclopaedia Britannica, first edition, contains an extensive entry on Tartary, describing it as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia on the north and west. This is called Great Tartary. The Tartars, who lie south of Muscovy and Siberia, are those of Astrakhan, Circassia, and Dagestan, situated northwest of the Caspian Sea. The Kalmyk Tartars, who lie between Siberia and the Caspian Sea. The Uzbek Tartars and Moguls, who lie north of Persia and India. And lastly, those of Tibet, who lie northwest of China. This is not vague terminology, this is specific geographic description with political subdivisions, comparable to how the encyclopedia described European nations. The text continues with details about Tartar customs, government, trade, and history, treating Tartaria as a known entity worthy of substantial documentation. Maps from the 18th and early 19th centuries continue showing Tartaria. The 1806 map by John Carey shows independent Tartary as a distinct political region. Russian maps from the 1800s depict Tartaria, even as Russian expansion was incorporating much of this territory into the Russian Empire. American maps from the same period, including those used in schools, showed Tartaria as a recognized geographic and political designation. The conventional explanation for these maps is straightforward. Tartaria, or Tartary, was the European name for the vast steppes and highlands of Central Asia, derived from Tartar, the name Europeans applied, often inaccurately, to the Mongol and Turkic peoples who inhabited these regions. The term gained currency after the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, when European writers referred to the Mongols as Tartars, deliberately echoing Tartarus, the Greek hell, reflecting European terror of Mongol conquest. The name stuck as a general designation for Central Asian territories and peoples, even though it never corresponded to a unified political entity. As European knowledge of Asia improved through exploration, trade, and diplomatic contacts in the 18th and 19th centuries, more specific names replaced the catch-all Tartary. Regions were more accurately identified as Mongolia, Turkestan, parts of the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty territories, and so forth. By the early 20th century, Tartary had fallen out of use except in historical contexts, replaced by more accurate geographic and political terminology. This is similar to how the Indies or the Orient fell out of use. They were vague European designations that became obsolete as geographic knowledge improved. But Tartaria proponents argue this explanation is insufficient. They point to maps that show Tartaria with specific borders, capital cities, and political structures that suggest more than just vague geographic designation. They note that maps distinguish between Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, and independent Tartary, suggesting the mapmakers understood political divisions and that at least some portion of Tartaria was independent, not controlled by China, Russia, or other known powers. The 1754 map by Jean Palairet shows Tartary Independente, independent Tartary, as a distinct region with its own cities and territories, separate from the Russian, Chinese, and Persian empires surrounding it. If Tartaria was merely European terminology for poorly understood regions, why would maps distinguish between dependent and independent Tartaries? The distinction suggests political reality, that some parts of this vast region were under the control of known powers, while other parts were governed by entities the Europeans recognized but did not fully understand. More intriguing are references to Tartarian cities. Maps and texts mention cities like Tartaria Magna, Great Tartary, sometimes with specific locations. Some maps show a capital or major city, though names vary between sources, suggesting either European confusion or actual political changes over time. The question is whether these cities existed as administrative centers of a unified Tartarian state, or whether they were simply prominent cities in a region that Europeans collectively called Tartaria. Tartaria proponents also point to the persistence of the name. If it was merely obsolete terminology, why would it appear consistently across centuries, across different European nations' maps, and in authoritative sources like encyclopedias? They argue that the systematic disappearance of the name from modern use, without clear explanation, in standard history textbooks about what happened to this vast territory and its people, suggests deliberate historical revision rather than organic evolution of geographic terminology. Mainstream historians counter that the disappearance is explained by improved knowledge. As European powers colonized or established diplomatic relations with Asian territories, they learned the actual names and political structures of regions they had previously lumped together as Tartary. The Qing dynasty controlled what maps called Chinese Tartary. The Russian Empire expanded into Russian Tartary. Independent Tartary fragmented into various khanates, tribal territories, and eventually Soviet republics. There was no single Tartarian civilization to erase, because there never was one just diverse peoples and territories that Europeans collectively misnamed. The debate over the maps centers on interpretation. Do they document a real political entity that has been forgotten or erased, or do they represent European misunderstanding and oversimplification that was later corrected? The maps themselves are real, the name is documented extensively, but what the name actually designated, whether geographic convention or civilizational reality, remains contested. The buildings that don't belong. Perhaps the most visually compelling evidence cited by Tartaria proponents is architectural buildings worldwide, particularly from the 19th century, that display a level of sophistication, consistency of style, and advanced engineering that seems inconsistent with conventional historical narratives about when and where such architecture should exist. These structures are often called Tartarian buildings or orphan buildings by proponents who argue they are remnants of an advanced global civilization rather than products of the local cultures and time periods to which they are officially attributed. The buildings share certain characteristics. Classical or neoclassical architecture featuring columns, domes, ornate facades, and symmetrical designs. Construction in materials like granite, marble, and other stone that require advanced quarrying and transport. Engineering features including large interior spaces, sophisticated ventilation, electrical or mechanical systems that seem anachronistic, and construction dates that proponents argue are too recent to explain the building's apparent age or too early to explain their technological sophistication. The World's Fair buildings of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. The fair featured hundreds of enormous neoclassical buildings constructed in a uniform architectural style, creating what was called the White City. Official history states these were temporary structures built rapidly from staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fibre, over wooden frames, intended to last only for the fair's duration and demolished afterward. But Tartaria proponents argue the buildings appear too solid, too well constructed, and too architecturally sophisticated to be temporary fair structures. They point to photographs showing the buildings with full infrastructure, electrical lighting, advanced plumbing, elaborate interiors, and question whether such systems would be installed in structures intended for demolition. They note that some fair buildings, like the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, were preserved and still stand, demonstrating permanence inconsistent with temporary construction. They ask why a civilization would build such magnificent structures only to destroy them within months, suggesting instead that the buildings already existed and the fair was created as explanation for their presence. Ornate government buildings, train stations, libraries, and other public structures from the 1800s and early 1900s, found in cities worldwide: San Francisco, Moscow, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Calcutta. These buildings often share similar architectural styles despite being in different countries and continents, suggesting to proponents either a global architectural movement or a common origin in an earlier global civilization. The buildings frequently feature advanced engineering, high ceilings, large windows, sophisticated acoustics, structural techniques that weren't supposedly widespread until later. Proponents question whether the official construction dates are accurate, suggesting the buildings might be older than recorded or might have been built using inherited techniques from earlier civilizations. Buildings that show evidence of being partially buried or having lowered first floors, suggesting what proponents call the mud flood, a catastrophic event they claim buried the lower levels of structures worldwide. They point to buildings with windows at or below ground level, basement windows that appear to have been first floor windows, and architectural features suggesting the ground level has risen several feet since construction. Mainstream explanations include deliberate grade changes during urban development, accumulation of sediment and construction debris over decades, and buildings constructed on sloped terrain where different sides have different ground levels. But proponents argue the widespread nature of this phenomenon appearing in cities across continents suggests a global catastrophic event rather than localized urban development. Atmospheric electricity systems in old buildings, including elaborate metal spires, domes, and architectural features that proponents suggest functioned as antennas or energy collectors for advanced power systems. They point to buildings with copper domes, metal ornamentation, and architectural features that seem unnecessarily elaborate unless they served functional purposes beyond decoration. They reference historical texts mentioning telluric currents and experiments with atmospheric electricity in the 19th century, suggesting this technology was more advanced than modern history acknowledges, and that these buildings incorporated it before petroleum-based power became dominant. The conventional historical explanation for these architectural patterns is well documented and straightforward. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a global architectural movement influenced by Beaux-Arts training, where architects from various nations studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and similar institutions, learning classical architectural principles and neoclassical styles. This created international consistency in public architecture, as architects applied similar training to buildings in their home countries. The period also saw dramatic advances in construction technology: steel framing, reinforced concrete, elevator technology, electric lighting that enabled larger, more ambitious structures than previously possible. The same decade saw rapid urbanization and economic growth in Europe, the Americas, and European colonies, providing both need and funding for impressive public buildings. World's fairs were explicitly designed as temporary showcases of national achievement and technological progress, using cheap materials to create impressive facades that could be constructed quickly and demolished without significant loss. The demolition of fair buildings was not waste, but standard practice. The land was valuable, the structures were deteriorating, staff crumbles rapidly when exposed to weather, and permanent maintenance would be expensive. Photographs showing solid-looking buildings don't contradict temporary construction. Staff over wooden frames can appear substantial but lacks durability. The mud flood evidence is explained by documented urban planning practices. Many cities, deliberately raised street grades during the 19th century to improve drainage, accommodate new sewer and water systems, and create level streets. Chicago raised its entire street grid by 4 to 14 feet in the 1850s, 1860s. Seattle regraded massive areas between 1900s, 1930s. Buildings constructed before these grade changes ended up with their original first floors below new street level, creating the appearance of burial. This is documented in city records, engineering reports, and contemporary accounts. No mysterious global catastrophe required. The architectural ornamentation had multiple purposes: aesthetic, symbolic, and sometimes functional: lightning rods, ventilation, acoustic enhancement. Copper domes oxidized to green, which was considered attractive and required no painting. Metal ornamentation demonstrated wealth and artistic sophistication. While 19th century scientists did experiment with atmospheric electricity and telluric currents, these never developed into practical power sources, and building designs incorporated standard electrical systems powered by generators and batteries, not atmospheric collection. The debate over Tartarian architecture centers on interpretation of evidence. Proponents see global consistency, advanced engineering, and anachronistic features as evidence of either a lost global civilization or inheritance of advanced knowledge from such a civilization. Mainstream historians see well-documented 19th century architectural movements advancing technology and urban planning practices that created the observed patterns through conventional historical processes. Both sides agree the buildings exist and are remarkable. They disagree about what they represent and whether official explanations adequately account for all the evidence. The photographs that raise questions. Beyond architecture and maps, Tartaria proponents point to photographs from the 19th and early 20th centuries that they argue show cities and technologies inconsistent with conventional historical timeline. These images, preserved in archives and historical collections, document urban landscapes, public events, and daily life in ways that proponents claim reveal anomalies mainstream history cannot adequately explain. Photographs of cities from the 1860s, 1880s, showing extensive development paved streets, multiple-story buildings, sophisticated infrastructure in locations that supposedly were frontier towns or recently established settlements. Proponents point to images of San Francisco, Chicago, Melbourne, and other cities showing mature urban development within decades of their supposed founding. They question whether cities could develop so rapidly using conventional 19th century construction methods, suggesting either the cities are older than official histories claim, or they were built using advanced techniques inherited from earlier civilizations. Mainstream historians note that 19th century urban development could indeed be rapid when conditions favored it: available capital, influx of settlers, economic opportunities, and modern construction methods. Standardized lumber, mass-produced building materials, railroad transport of materials and workers enabled cities to grow from small settlements to substantial urban centers in 20 to 30 years. The California Gold Rush, 1848 to 1855, brought enormous wealth and population to San Francisco, funding rapid development. Chicago grew explosively due to its position as railroad hub and Great Lakes port. These documented economic and demographic drivers explain rapid urban growth without requiring alternative explanations. Old photographs showing electrical street lighting, trolley systems, and other infrastructure in the 1880s, 1890s that proponents argue appear too advanced for the period. They note that while electric lighting was invented in the late 1870s, its rapid deployment across multiple cities worldwide seems inconsistent with how new technologies typically diffuse. They suggest this rapid adoption indicates the technology wasn't actually new, but was being re-implemented after disruption. Historical records document the competitive deployment of electric systems. Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Station began operating in New York in 1882. By the late 1880s, electric companies were aggressively marketing systems to cities worldwide. Driven by profit motive and civic competition, cities wanted modern amenities to attract business and residents. The technology spread rapidly precisely because it was revolutionary and commercially valuable, following patterns similar to other transformative technologies, railroads, telegraphs, telephones. The deployment was well documented in newspapers, business records, and municipal archives. Images from World's Fairs showing enormous structures that proponents argue could not have been built as quickly as official timelines claim or appear too permanent to be temporary exhibitions. The 1893 Chicago Fair particularly features in these arguments. Photographs show hundreds of elaborate buildings covering over 600 acres, constructed in about 2 years. Proponents question whether this was realistically achievable, suggesting the buildings already existed and the fair was created around them. Construction records for the 1893 fair are extensively documented. Daniel Burnham, chief architect, employed thousands of workers, used standardized building techniques, staff over wooden frames, and applied industrial-scale organization to achieve rapid construction. Contemporary accounts describe the construction process in detail. The fact that most buildings were demolished immediately after the fair, as documented in photographs and news reports, contradicts claims they were pre-existing permanent structures. The surviving Palace of Fine Arts was specifically built with more durable materials because it was intended for preservation. Its survival proves the exception, not the rule. Photographs showing groups of people in the late 1800s wearing clothing and displaying technology that proponents claim appears more advanced than period appropriate. They point to image quality itself. Some photographs from the 1860s, 1880s show remarkable clarity and detail that they argue shouldn't be possible with early photographic technology. Photographic technology advanced rapidly in the mid-19th century. The wet collodion process, 1850s, 1880s, produced extremely high-resolution images, often sharper than later processes. Large format cameras, common in 19th century photography, captured extraordinary detail. The images that survive in archives are often original glass plates or first-generation prints, preserving quality that deteriorated in later copies. The technology was sophisticated precisely because it required extensive skill and knowledge to use. Photographers were trained professionals using chemical processes and optical systems that, while different from modern technology, were capable of excellent results. Images showing city streets with few people, which proponents interpret as evidence of depopulation following catastrophe. They note photographs from the 1860s, 1890s showing extensive urban infrastructure but relatively empty streets, suggesting populations were smaller than the built environment would support. Early photography required long exposure, times seconds to minutes, depending on lighting and method. Moving people and animals appeared blurred or invisible in photographs. Cities weren't empty. The photographic process simply couldn't capture moving subjects clearly. Additionally, photographers deliberately chose times and locations with minimal movement to achieve clear images. Photos showing empty streets are artifacts of technology and photographer choice, not evidence of depopulation. The debate over photographs parallels debates over other evidence. Proponents see anomalies and inconsistencies suggesting hidden history, while mainstream historians see well-documented technology and development patterns that the photographic record confirms rather than contradicts. The photographs are real, but their interpretation depends on understanding both the technology that created them and the historical context they document. The timeline that doesn't add up. Central to Tartaria theories is the claim that official historical timelines contain gaps, compressions, and impossibilities that indicate either massive historical revision or fundamental errors in how we understand the past. Proponents argue that when you examine what supposedly happened in the 19th century, the construction, the technological development, the population movements, the political changes, the timeline becomes implausibly compressed, suggesting either the century lasted longer than claimed or major events occurred earlier than officially recorded. Consider the construction timeline argument. In the span of roughly 50 to 70 years, approximately 1850 to 1920, the following supposedly occurred simultaneously across the globe. Hundreds of major cities built or massively expanded with ornate stone architecture, continental railroad networks constructed spanning thousands of miles, canals dug connecting major waterways, telegraph and telephone networks spanning continents and oceans, electric power infrastructure deployed to cities worldwide, water and sewer systems installed in urban areas, universities, libraries, train stations, government buildings, opera houses, and other monumental structures constructed in classical styles. Proponents argue this amount of construction is implausible with available labor, materials, and technology, suggesting either the timeline is compressed, these developments actually took longer, or the buildings already existed and were merely restored or repurposed. Mainstream historians note that this period witnessed unprecedented economic growth, industrial revolution, massive population increase, improved construction technology, and deliberate investment in infrastructure and public works. The developments were not mysterious, but resulted from specific economic and technological factors. Steam power enabled faster construction and transport, standardized building materials reduced construction time, corporate capitalism concentrated resources for large projects, nationalism motivated monumental architecture demonstrating state power, growing urban populations created demand for infrastructure. The timeline is compressed compared to earlier centuries precisely because technology enabled faster development. This is the expected result of industrialization, not evidence it didn't happen. The technology development timeline presents similar questions. Proponents note that technologies supposedly invented or developed in the mid to late 1800s appeared globally within years or decades. Photography, 1820s, 1840s, railroads, 1830s, 1840s, telegraphs, 1830s, 1850s, telephones, 1870s, 1880s, electric lighting, 1870s, 1880s, automobiles, 1880s, 1890s, powered flight, 1900s, radio, 1890s, 1900s. Each technology went from invention to commercial deployment to global adoption within a single generation. Proponents argue this pace seems impossibly fast compared to how technology developed in previous centuries, suggesting these weren't new inventions, but rediscovery or re-implementation of older technologies after disruption. The conventional explanation is that industrialization created positive feedback loops. Each technological advance enabled faster development of subsequent technologies. Railroad networks enabled transport of materials and components, accelerating construction and manufacturing. Telegraph networks enabled rapid communication of ideas and coordination of commerce, speeding innovation diffusion. Steam power provided reliable energy for factories, enabling mass production. Each advance built on previous advances, creating exponential rather than linear development. The pace seems impossibly fast only if you expect linear development. It's exactly what you'd predict from interconnected technological systems reaching critical mass. Population timelines also generate questions. Proponents note that cities supposedly founded in the mid-1800s achieved populations of hundreds of thousands within decades, requiring implausibly high birth rates or immigration numbers. They point to census records showing dramatic population increases and question whether such growth was demographically possible. Historical records document massive immigration. Tens of millions of Europeans, Asians, and others migrated to the Americas, Australia, and colonial territories in the 19th century, driven by poverty, political instability, and opportunity. The Great Famine in Ireland, 1845 to 1852, drove millions to emigrate. Economic opportunities in American cities attracted immigrants from across Europe. The California Gold Rush, various land rushes, and industrial employment drew populations to specific locations. These movements are documented in ship manifests, immigration records, census data, and contemporary accounts. High immigration combined with high birth rates, common before widespread birth control, enabled dramatic urban growth. The catastrophe timeline is perhaps most central to Tartaria theories. Proponents argue evidence exists for a global catastrophic event in the 19th century, possibly a mud flood, possibly a military conflict, possibly a reset of civilization that mainstream history has erased or explained away. They point to the alleged evidence: buildings with buried first floors, cities rapidly rebuilt, population disruptions, technological discontinuities. They note that if such catastrophe occurred around 1800 to 1850, it would explain why cities needed rapid reconstruction, why certain technologies seemed to appear suddenly, and why a civilization like Tartaria could disappear from history. Mainstream history identifies numerous catastrophes in the 19th century: Napoleonic Wars, various colonial wars, disease epidemics, earthquakes, fires, but no global event that would reset civilization. The events cited as evidence for catastrophe all have conventional explanations: grade changes, documented reconstruction after specific known disasters, ordinary technological and urban development. The absence of contemporary accounts describing global catastrophe, the lack of geological evidence for worldwide flooding or similar events in the early 19th century, and the continuity of historical records across this period all argue against undocumented global disaster. The timeline debate ultimately questions whether official history adequately explains the pace of change in the 19th century, or whether that pace requires alternative explanations involving hidden history, forgotten catastrophes, or civilizational resets. Proponents see compression and impossibility. Mainstream historians see industrial acceleration and well-documented rapid change. Both interpretations rely on the same evidence, viewed through different assumptions about what was possible and what the historical record actually tells us. The mud flood theory. Among Tartaria proponents, one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for a catastrophic event that destroyed or disrupted Tartarian civilization is what they call the mud flood, a worldwide inundation of mud, earth, or sediment that they claim buried the lower levels of buildings, destroyed infrastructure, and forced civilizations to rebuild on top of the buried remains of the previous world. The primary evidence cited for this mud flood consists of architectural observations, buildings in cities worldwide showing windows at or below current ground level, suggesting the structures were built when ground level was lower. Basement or cellar windows that appear architecturally to have been designed as first-floor windows based on their size, ornamentation, or positioning. Entrance stairs descending to reach doors that appear to be positioned lower than would make sense if the structure was built at current ground level. And buildings where multiple floors are currently underground, visible only in basement or foundation excavations, suggesting they were above ground when originally constructed. Proponents argue this pattern appears too consistently across too many cities to be explained by local factors. They point to examples in Europe, The Americas, Asia, and Australia, where buildings show similar characteristics, windows below grade, buried lower floors, entrance configurations suggesting ground level rise. They argue this global pattern indicates a global cause, a catastrophic event that deposited enormous amounts of mud, soil, or sediment worldwide, burying the lower levels of existing structures and forcing survivors to rebuild on top of the deposited material. Additional evidence cited includes historical accounts of floods, unusual sediment deposits, and buried structures. They reference archaeological discoveries of buildings and cities buried under multiple feet or meters of earth, arguing these prove catastrophic burial rather than gradual accumulation. They point to geological formations and sediment layers that they interpret as evidence of rapid deposition rather than slow geological processes. The mainstream geological and historical explanation for buildings with buried first floors is well documented and varies by location but follows consistent patterns. In many cities, deliberate grade changes occurred in the 19th and early 20th centuries as urban planning improved. Cities raised street levels to improve drainage, install underground utilities, water mains, sewer systems, subway tunnels, create level transportation routes, and address flooding problems. Chicago provides the best documented example. Between 1855 to 1860, the city raised street grades by 4 to 14 feet across much of downtown, installing new sewers and creating proper drainage. Buildings constructed before this regrading ended up with their original first floors below new street level. Some buildings were jacked up to match new grades. Others simply had new entrances built at the raised street level, converting original first floors to basements. The process is documented in city engineering records, contemporary newspaper accounts, and photographs showing buildings mid-lift. Similar regrading occurred in Seattle, San Francisco, and other cities. These are historical facts, not speculation. Sediment accumulation provides another explanation. Cities that existed for centuries before modern sanitation accumulated significant debris, discarded construction materials, refuse, organic material. Streets were unpaved or poorly paved, and material constantly washed or was deposited during floods. Over decades or centuries, ground level rose gradually as material accumulated. Archaeological excavations in Rome, Athens, London, and other ancient cities consistently show modern ground level several meters above ancient street levels. This is normal urban archaeology, not evidence of catastrophe. In areas with actual flood history, river valleys, coastal zones, periodic flooding did deposit sediment. Cities on major rivers experienced regular inundation before modern flood control, each flood leaving sediment layers. Over centuries, this raised ground level. Historical records document these floods, and geological analysis shows gradual sediment accumulation rather than single catastrophic deposit. The sediment layers contain artifacts and materials dating from different periods, proving deposition occurred over extended time, not in single event. Natural processes also explain some observations. Soil erosion from surrounding hills can wash sediment into valley settlements over time. Wind-blown dust and dirt accumulate. Construction debris is often used to fill low areas, raising ground level. Buildings on sloped terrain naturally have different ground levels on different sides. None of these require catastrophic explanation. Proponents respond that while individual cases might be explained by local factors, the global pattern requires global explanation. They argue mainstream history acknowledges some deliberate grade changes, but cannot explain why such changes were necessary. Why were drainage problems universal enough to require raising street levels in cities worldwide during the same period, mid to late 1800s? They suggest the drainage problems resulted from a mud flood that affected cities globally, and the grade raising was response to catastrophe rather than independent urban planning decisions. They also question the timeline of sediment accumulation explanations. If ground level rose gradually over centuries through accumulated debris, why do buildings from the same period, often the 1800s, show similar amounts of burial? They argue that if accumulation was gradual, older buildings should show more burial than newer ones, but the evidence shows relatively consistent burial across buildings from similar periods, suggesting a sudden event rather than gradual process. The geological evidence debate centers on sediment layers. Proponents point to layers of clay, mud, or loess, wind-deposited silt, found in many regions and argue these represent rapid catastrophic deposition. Geologists respond that these layers form through well-understood processes over extended periods. Loess accumulates from wind transport over thousands of years. Clay deposits form in lakebeds and floodplains through seasonal flooding, and stratification within these layers proves gradual formation. The layers contain fossils, minerals, and structures that form only through slow processes, contradicting rapid deposition claims. The mud flood theory lacks the single most critical piece of evidence that would prove a global catastrophe: contemporary accounts. If a worldwide mud flood occurred in the 1800s or early 1900s, when literacy was widespread and newspapers, letters, diaries, government records, and other documentation were being generated in enormous quantities, there should be extensive contemporary evidence, survivors' accounts, news reports, official responses, scientific investigations. The absence of any such documentation, despite the supposed catastrophe occurring during history's most documented period, is perhaps the strongest argument against the theory. Proponents respond that historical revision erased these accounts, that records were destroyed or suppressed, or that what we interpret as local disaster accounts, specific floods, earthquakes, fires, actually describe aspects of the global catastrophe, but have been reinterpreted to seem local and unconnected. But this requires assuming a cover-up of implausible scale and effectiveness, suppressing all accounts across all nations and languages, coordinating revision across competing and often hostile governments, and maintaining the deception for over a century without any whistleblowers, leaked documents, or preserved original records surfacing. The mud flood theory remains popular among Tartaria proponents because it provides a mechanism for the civilization's destruction and explains architectural observations in a single catastrophic narrative. But it lacks the geological evidence, contemporary documentation, and global coordination that such an event would necessarily produce, leaving it as speculation built on architectural observations that have well-documented conventional explanations. The alternative history community. The claims about Tartaria have found receptive audience in online alternative history communities, where they merge with other narratives questioning official historical accounts. Understanding why these theories appeal requires examining both the evidence they cite and the cultural and epistemological context in which they circulate. The Tartaria narrative addresses several themes that resonate with alternative history enthusiasts. First, it suggests hidden history, the idea that the past was significantly different from what mainstream sources claim, that advanced civilizations existed and were forgotten or deliberately erased, and that evidence of these civilizations remains visible to those who know where to look. This appeals to individuals skeptical of institutional authority, who believe official narratives serve political or ideological purposes rather than objective truth. Second, it invokes technological regression, the claim that humanity once possessed advanced capabilities that were lost, that we are rediscovering rather than discovering technology, and that previous civilizations might have been more sophisticated than ours. This appeals to those uncomfortable with progressive narratives of history, who see modern society's problems and wonder whether earlier societies had superior knowledge, values, or technologies. Third, it involves conspiracy, the assertion that powerful institutions deliberately suppress truth about the past, that historical revision occurred on global scale, and that mainstream academics are either ignorant of real history or complicit in its concealment. This appeals to those who distrust established institutions, see patterns of deception in contemporary politics and media, and believe those patterns extend to control of historical knowledge. The community centered on Tartaria research is diverse, including researchers with varying levels of credibility and different motivations. Some approach it as historical detective work, compiling architectural evidence, examining old maps and photographs, and attempting to construct coherent alternative narratives. Others merge Tartaria claims with broader conspiracy theories about global elites, energy suppression, or spiritual warfare. Still others treat it as fascinating speculation, enjoying the mystery, without necessarily committing to specific claims. The methodology employed varies widely. More careful researchers acknowledge uncertainty, present evidence for evaluation, and engage with mainstream counter-arguments. Less rigorous advocates assert claims as facts, dismiss contrary evidence as disinformation, and attack critics as part of the cover-up. The community lacks institutional structure or peer review, meaning quality control depends on individual critical thinking and community self-correction, which is inconsistent at best. Social media has amplified Tartaria theories by enabling rapid dissemination of images, ideas, and arguments without the gatekeeping traditionally imposed by academic publishing or mainstream media. YouTube videos, Reddit forums, Telegram channels, and other platforms allow anyone to present theories, share evidence, and build audiences. The algorithmic promotion of engaging content means provocative claims about hidden civilizations can reach millions, while academic rebuttals, often technical, cautious, and less visually compelling, receive less attention. The visual nature of much evidence, photographs of buildings, maps showing Tartaria, architectural details makes it particularly effective in social media environments where images and videos generate more engagement than text-heavy analysis. A photograph of a building with windows below ground level is immediately striking and seems to demand explanation. The conventional explanation deliberate grade change documented in city records is less visually compelling and requires understanding urban planning history that most viewers lack. The community's relationship with mainstream academia is antagonistic. Tartaria proponents generally believe academics are either ignorant of evidence that contradicts official history or are deliberately suppressing it to maintain institutional authority and funding. Mainstream historians largely ignore Tartaria claims as pseudo-history unworthy of serious engagement, occasionally producing rebuttals but generally declining to debate advocates. This mutual dismissal reinforces both sides' existing positions. Proponents see academic dismissal as evidence of cover-up, while academics see proponents' unwillingness to engage with technical objections as evidence of bad faith or incompetence. Some proponents do have legitimate grievances about mainstream history. Academic history can be politically influenced, interpretations do change over time, and established narratives sometimes resist revision, even when evidence warrants reconsideration. Indigenous histories were dismissed or distorted by colonial academics. The achievements of non-European civilizations were minimized or attributed to outside influence. Academic consensus has been wrong before and could be wrong again, but this doesn't mean every alternative claim is correct, or that skepticism of mainstream narratives automatically validates any specific alternative. The fact that mainstream history has flaws doesn't prove Tartaria existed or that mud floods destroyed global civilization. The fact that some historical revision has occurred doesn't prove current revisions are ongoing, or that specific institutions are suppressing specific truths. Critical thinking requires evaluating each claim on its evidence, not accepting claims because they oppose establishment narratives. The alternative history community provides space for questions mainstream academia often dismisses. Some of these questions are worth asking. Why did certain architectural styles appear globally in similar periods? How did pre-industrial civilizations accomplish specific engineering feats? Are there gaps in our understanding of technological development? But providing space for questions is different from validating specific answers. The Tartaria narrative provides grand, comprehensive answers that explain everything from architecture to maps to photographs with a single overarching story. The appeal is understandable. The problem is whether the story is supported by evidence or whether it's an elaborate construction built on misinterpretations and pattern seeking. The community serves social and psychological functions beyond historical inquiry. It provides community people connected by shared interests and beliefs who support each other's investigations. It provides purpose, the quest to uncover hidden truth and challenge powerful institutions. It provides explanatory power, a framework making sense of perceived anomalies and inconsistencies. These are valuable things which may partly explain why Tartaria theories persist even as mainstream historians point out their flaws. The theories serve needs beyond mere historical accuracy. Understanding the alternative history community requires recognizing it's not simply about evidence and arguments, but about trust, meaning, identity, and the desire to believe there's more to the world than official narratives acknowledge. Whether that desire leads to genuine insight or to pattern seeking that finds what it wants to find remains the central question that each proponent and each observer must answer for themselves. The academic response. Mainstream historians and archaeologists who have addressed Tartaria claims generally treat them as a mix of misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and motivated reasoning rather than as a coherent alternative history worthy of serious academic engagement. The academic response, where it exists, focuses on several key rebuttals that attempt to explain the evidence cited by proponents without requiring lost civilizations or historical erasure. The maps showing Tartaria are explained as European geographic terminology for Central Asian regions inhabited by Turkic and Mongol peoples. The name Tartar or Tartar was applied by medieval Europeans to Mongol invaders and subsequently became a catch-all term for the vast steppes and highlands of Asia about which Europeans knew little. As European knowledge improved through exploration and diplomatic contact, more specific terminology replaced the vague Tartary. The persistence of Tartaria on maps through the 18th and early 19th centuries simply reflects conservative cartographic practices. Mapmakers copied information from earlier maps when they lacked better data, creating lag between actual geographic knowledge and published maps. The independent Tartary designations refer to regions not controlled by Russia, China, or other recognized powers, areas where various khanates, tribal confederations, and local rulers maintained autonomy. These were real political entities, the Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Mongols, and others who inhabited the region. But they weren't unified under a Tartarian state that was European projection. The disappearance of the name is explained by improved knowledge and political changes. As the Russian Empire expanded through Central Asia in the 19th century, and as the Qing dynasty solidified control over Western China and Mongolia, European maps began using more accurate designations. Tartary became obsolete, the same way the Indies, or New World, became obsolete not because places disappeared, but because better terminology emerged. Modern textbooks don't discuss Tartaria, not because it's being suppressed, but because it was never a unified civilization. It was a geographic designation that cartographic precision rendered unnecessary. The architecture cited as evidence of Tartarian civilization is explained through well-documented historical processes. The 19th century witnessed a global Beaux-Arts movement that trained architects from various nations in classical styles, creating international consistency in public architecture. Technological advances, steel framing, reinforced concrete, standardized materials, railroad transport enabled rapid construction of impressive buildings. Economic growth in industrializing nations provided funding for monumental architecture that demonstrated national prestige and civic pride. The World's Fair buildings that proponents find suspicious are documented in extensive contemporary records. The 1893 Chicago Fair's construction was covered in newspapers, photographed extensively, described in official reports, and analyzed by architects and engineers. The buildings were made of staff, plaster, and fiber over wooden frames, designed for temporary use, and were indeed demolished after the fair because they were deteriorating and the land was valuable. The handful of buildings preserved, like the Palace of Fine Arts, were specifically constructed with more durable materials because preservation was intended from the beginning. Their survival proves the exception, not that all buildings were permanent structures falsely claimed to be temporary. The buried first floors and alleged mudflood evidence are explained by documented urban planning practices. Many cities deliberately raised street grades in the 19th century to install sewers, improve drainage, accommodate new infrastructure, and create level transportation routes. Chicago, Seattle, and other cities have extensive documentation of these regrading projects in engineering records, newspapers, and photographs. Buildings with windows below current grade level were built before regrading occurred. Their apparent burial is a result of human engineering decisions, not catastrophic floods. Gradual sediment accumulation is another well-understood process. Cities accumulate construction debris, organic material, and eroded soil over time, gradually raising ground level. This is normal urban geology observed in cities worldwide and doesn't require catastrophic explanation. Where actual flooding occurred, historical records document specific flood events. These were local disasters, not global catastrophes. The timeline questions are addressed by pointing to specific technological, economic, and demographic factors that enabled rapid 19th century development. Industrialization provided tools, materials, and transportation that accelerated construction. Corporate capitalism concentrated capital for large projects. Population growth and immigration provided labor and demand for urban expansion. These are not mysterious forces, but documented historical processes that explain observed development without requiring compression of time or hidden older civilizations. The photographic evidence is explained through understanding the technology. Early photography produced high-quality images precisely because it was sophisticated large-format cameras, chemical processes requiring expertise, and glass plate negatives captured extraordinary detail. Long exposure times meant moving subjects disappeared from images, creating the impression of empty streets when cities were actually busy. The quality and characteristics of 19th century photographs are consistent with documented photographic technology, not anomalous. The absence of contemporary accounts describing a global catastrophic event in the 19th century is perhaps the strongest argument against Tartaria theories. This was history's most documented period. Literacy was widespread. Newspapers existed across the globe. Governments kept extensive records. Personal letters and diaries were common. And scientific societies investigated natural phenomena, If a global mud flood, civilizational reset, or similar catastrophe occurred, extensive contemporary documentation would exist. Its absence, no survivor accounts, no government responses, no scientific investigations, no news coverage across multiple languages and nations, strongly suggests no such event happened. Mainstream academics also note that Tartaria theories require an implausibly massive and effective conspiracy. Suppressing all evidence of a global civilization and catastrophic event would require coordination across competing and hostile nations, across different languages and cultures, across academic disciplines and institutions, and across generations of historians, archaeologists, and scientists. It would require destroying or suppressing documents, photographs, and artifacts while somehow preventing any leaks or preserved authentic records from surfacing. It would require that everyone involved in the conspiracy, from government officials to museum curators to university professors across the world, either agreed to suppress truth or was successfully deceived. The logistics of such suppression, maintained for over a century, strain credibility beyond breaking. The academic response essentially argues that Tartaria claims rest on misunderstanding cartographic history, misinterpreting architectural and photographic evidence, and assuming conspiracy when simpler explanations based on documented historical processes adequately account for the observations. While individual academics may engage with specific Tartaria claims in blog posts, YouTube responses, or social media, mainstream historical and archaeological institutions generally don't address the theories in formal academic literature, treating them as fringe speculation rather than legitimate alternative history, requiring serious scholarly rebuttal. This dismissiveness frustrates Tartaria proponents, who see it as evidence academics won't engage because they can't refute the evidence. But from the academic perspective, engaging extensively with every alternative history theory that contradicts established knowledge would be unproductive use of limited time and resources. Standards of historical evidence require supporting claims with contemporary documentation, archaeological findings that can be independently verified, and peer-reviewed analysis. Tartaria theories, in mainstream academic view, don't meet these standards and therefore don't warrant the same attention as claims supported by conventional evidence. The gulf between alternative history communities and mainstream academia on Tartaria remains wide, with little productive dialogue occurring. Both sides largely talk past each other, proponents demanding academics explain specific pieces of evidence, academics insisting the overall framework lacks foundation, and specific evidence has conventional explanations proponents refuse to accept. Whether this gulf can be bridged, or whether Tartaria will remain a theory that circulates in alternative communities while being dismissed by mainstream institutions, likely depends on whether new evidence emerges that cannot be explained through conventional historical processes, or whether existing evidence can be shown definitively to have conventional explanations that proponents have overlooked. The question of evidence. At the heart of the Tartaria controversy is a fundamental disagreement about what constitutes valid historical evidence and how conflicting interpretations should be resolved. This disagreement extends beyond factual disputes about specific maps or buildings to epistemological questions about how we know what we know about the past and what level of certainty is required before accepting or rejecting historical claims. Proponents of Tartaria theories argue they are simply following the evidence. They see maps that consistently show a place called Tartaria for centuries. They observe buildings that appear too sophisticated for their conventional dating. They notice photographs that seem inconsistent with official timelines. They find patterns, architectural consistency across continents, similar structural features suggesting common cause, historical accounts that seem to describe events mainstream history doesn't acknowledge. They conclude this evidence points to a reality different from official narratives, and they fault mainstream historians for dismissing their observations without adequately explaining them. From the proponent's perspective, the burden of proof should fall on those defending established narratives to explain anomalies. If maps show Tartaria, explain what it actually was and why the name disappeared. If buildings have buried first floors across multiple continents, explain the global pattern. If photographs show advanced development earlier than expected, explain how it was achieved. If these explanations are not satisfactory or complete, then alternative explanations, including lost civilizations and historical revision, should remain on the table as possibilities. Mainstream historians argue the situation is precisely reversed. The burden of proof falls on those making extraordinary claims that contradict established understanding. Before accepting that a global civilization existed and was erased from history, we need extraordinary evidence, contemporary documents describing Tartaria as a unified state. Archaeological remains clearly linked to a Tartarian civilization. Artifacts or technologies that cannot be explained as products of known civilizations, and evidence of how and why such a comprehensive historical revision could be accomplished. In the absence of such evidence, historians argue, conventional explanations that align with documented historical processes should be preferred, even if they don't answer every question perfectly. Science and history routinely have incomplete explanations for observations. This incompleteness doesn't mean alternative explanations lacking supporting evidence should be accepted. The maps showing Tartaria are explained as geographic terminology. That explanation is consistent with cartographic history, even if some details remain debated. The architecture is explained through documented 19th century construction and planning. That explanation accounts for observations without requiring hidden civilizations. The preference is for explanations that fit known facts over explanations that require assuming facts for which we have no direct evidence. This creates an impasse rooted in different standards of evidence. Proponents believe the patterns they observe constitute evidence requiring explanation, and they fault mainstream history for not providing explanations they find adequate. Mainstream historians believe patterns aren't evidence by themselves, correlation doesn't imply causation, and apparent patterns can result from cognitive biases like pareidolia, seeing patterns where none exist, and confirmation bias, noticing evidence supporting beliefs while dismissing contrary evidence. The question of what counts as evidence is complicated by the nature of historical inquiry. Unlike controlled experiments where variables can be isolated and tested, history deals with unique events that cannot be repeated or directly observed. Historical knowledge is always inferential. We examine surviving evidence and construct narratives that best explain that evidence. But the evidence is incomplete. Most historical material doesn't survive. Biased. What survives is determined by preservation conditions and historical processes, not random selection. And open to interpretation, documents can be read different ways. Artifacts can suggest multiple possibilities. This means historical knowledge is always provisional and subject to revision when new evidence appears or when reinterpretation of existing evidence proves more compelling. Mainstream historians acknowledge this and point to genuine revisions in historical understanding, recognition of Viking exploration of North America before Columbus, revaluation of African and pre-Columbian American civilizations, new understanding of plague impacts on medieval society. These revisions occurred because new evidence, archaeological discoveries, new readings of documents, scientific dating methods supported different interpretations. But revisions require evidence, not just alternative narratives. The Viking exploration was confirmed by archaeological sites like Lonceau Meadows, dated objects, and documents in Old Norse describing exploration. Pre-Columbian civilization's sophistication was demonstrated through archaeological excavation, decipherment of writing systems, and analysis of artifacts and structures. These weren't speculative alternatives, but evidence-based revisions. Tartaria proponents argue their evidence, the maps, architecture, photographs, is similarly concrete and should trigger revision. Mainstream historians counter that this evidence has conventional explanations consistent with documented history, and that accepting Tartaria would require overturning vast amounts of historical knowledge without the kind of definitive new evidence that justified previous revisions. The evidentiary question also involves the absence of evidence. Mainstream historians note that a global civilization spanning continents should leave enormous archaeological footprints, distinctive artifacts, writing systems, architectural styles, trade goods, infrastructure, administrative documents, religious texts, and so forth. The Mongol Empire, Roman Empire, and other large-scale political entities left extensive evidence that allowed historians to map their territories, understand their governments, and trace their influence. If Tartaria was remotely comparable, similar evidence should exist. The absence of such evidence, no clearly Tartarian artifacts in museums, no inscriptions in Tartarian language, no administrative documents describing Tartarian government, no archaeological sites definitively identified as Tartarian suggests Tartaria, as proponents envision, it didn't exist. Proponents respond that evidence has been suppressed, misattributed, or destroyed, but this requires assuming systematic removal of evidence on a scale for which we have no precedent. The question ultimately becomes, what level of speculation is reasonable when evidence is ambiguous? Proponents believe uncertainty justifies exploration of alternative possibilities. Mainstream historians believe speculation should be constrained by evidence, and that alternatives lacking positive supporting evidence shouldn't be treated as equally valid to explanations consistent with documented history. This epistemological disagreement may be irresolvable because it reflects different values about certainty, authority, and how to handle ambiguity. Those suspicious of institutional authority are more willing to entertain alternatives that contradict establishment narratives. Those who value systematic evidence gathering and peer review insist on higher standards before accepting claims that overturn established understanding. Neither position is inherently unreasonable, but they lead to different conclusions about the same evidence. The Tartaria controversy thus serves as case study in how historical knowledge is constructed, contested, and defended. It raises genuine questions about cartographic practices, architectural history, urban development, and the completeness of historical records. Whether those questions point to hidden civilizations and historical revision, or merely to gaps in public understanding of well-documented historical processes, depends ultimately on which evidentiary standards and interpretive frameworks one applies, and that choice itself reflects broader beliefs about knowledge, authority, and how to distinguish truth from speculation when dealing with the uncertain and fragmentary record of the human past. The enduring mystery, whether Tartaria was the greatest civilization wiped from human history, cannot be definitively answered because the question itself contains assumptions that different observers assess differently. Was there a civilization called Tartaria? If civilization means a unified political entity with common culture, language, and institutions, mainstream history says no, it was geographic terminology. If it means peoples inhabiting a region Europeans called Tartary, yes, various Turkic, Mongol, and other groups lived there, but calling them collectively Tartarian civilization is European projection rather than self-identification. Was it great? The achievements of Central Asian peoples, the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road cities, Islamic scholars in Samarkand and Bukhara, nomadic cultures adapted to harsh environments, were indeed significant. But these weren't products of a unified Tartarian state. They were achievements of various peoples and polities that happened to inhabit regions Europeans labeled Tartary. Attributing them to Tartarian civilization obscures the actual diversity and complexity of Central Asian history. Was it wiped from history? The name Tartary disappeared from common use as geographic knowledge improved and more accurate terminology emerged. This is documented linguistic and cartographic evolution, not erasure. The peoples and cultures didn't disappear. They're represented in modern nations of Central Asia, in historical scholarship on the Mongol Empire and Silk Road, in archaeological work throughout the region. If there's criticism to be made, it's that Western-centric history often undervalues non-European achievements, but that's different from claiming a specific civilization was deliberately erased. The buildings, photographs, and other evidence cited by Tartaria proponents are real, and some raise legitimate questions about construction timelines, technological development, and urban planning history. But legitimate questions don't automatically validate specific answers. The fact that we don't fully understand how certain 19th century achievements were accomplished doesn't mean they weren't accomplished through conventional means. The fact that some historical details are debated or incompletely documented doesn't mean entire civilizations have been hidden. What the Tartaria phenomenon reveals most clearly is the gap between public historical understanding and academic historical knowledge. Most people are not familiar with 19th century urban planning, Beaux-Arts architecture, cartographic evolution, or photographic technology. When they encounter evidence that seems anomalous, buildings with buried floors, maps showing unfamiliar names, photographs of sophisticated infrastructure, they lack the context to evaluate it. Alternative narratives provide that context, offering explanatory frameworks that make sense of apparent anomalies, even if those frameworks aren't supported by specialist knowledge. This gap exists partly because academic history is specialized and technical, published in journals and books most people never read, written in language that prioritizes precision over accessibility. The expertise needed to evaluate architectural dating, interpret historical maps, or analyze urban development patterns is not widely distributed. This creates space for alternative narratives that don't require specialist knowledge and that provide simpler, more dramatic explanations for complex phenomena. It also exists because people want history to be more interesting than it sometimes is. The idea of lost advanced civilizations, global catastrophes, and hidden truths is more compelling than gradual urban development, evolving cartographic terminology, and well-documented construction projects. Mystery and conspiracy are inherently more engaging than meticulous archival research and technical analysis. Alternative history thrives, not just because mainstream history has flaws, but because alternative narratives offer what conventional history often cannot: drama, revelation, and the satisfaction of believing you've uncovered truth that others have missed or suppressed. Whether Tartaria theories will persist, grow, or eventually fade depends on factors beyond evidence: cultural trends in trust of institutions, the evolution of social media and online communities, whether mainstream historians engage more effectively with public audiences, and whether new technologies, satellite archaeology, improved dating methods, digitization of historical archives, provide evidence that settles debates one way or another. What's certain is that the questions Tartaria theories raise won't disappear simply because mainstream historians dismiss them. People will continue noticing buildings with unusual features, examining old maps with unfamiliar place names, and wondering whether official narratives tell the complete story. Whether those observations lead to genuine historical insight or to elaborate constructions built on misinterpretations depends on maintaining rigorous evidentiary standards while remaining open to legitimate revision when evidence warrants it. The maps showed a place called Tartaria. That's historical fact. The buildings stand, magnificent and sometimes mysterious. That's architectural reality. The photographs document urban development that seems impossibly rapid by pre-industrial standards. That's photographic evidence. What these facts mean, whether they point to hidden civilizations or to well-understood historical processes that public education has failed to communicate effectively, is the question each observer must evaluate based on evidence, standards of proof, and assumptions about how history works and how knowledge is constructed and transmitted across generations. Tartaria, whether it existed as proponents claim or merely as cartographic terminology that mainstream history describes, has become a Rorschach test. What people see in the evidence reveals as much about their assumptions, values, and epistemological commitments as it does about the past itself. And that perhaps is the enduring lesson. History is not just about what happened, but about how we know what happened, who we trust to tell us, and what we're willing to believe based on incomplete and sometimes contradictory evidence that survives from times and places increasingly distant from our own understanding and experience. The world's fairs and the architecture of impermanence. Among the most visually striking evidence cited by Tartaria proponents are the world's fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly the elaborate temporary structures that hosted these international exhibitions. The fairs featured hundreds of enormous buildings constructed in unified architectural styles, creating spectacular urban landscapes that appeared to rival permanent cities in their scale and sophistication. Yet, according to official history, these magnificent structures were built rapidly, used briefly, and then demolished, a pattern proponents find implausible and suspicious. The 1,893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago stands as the exemplar of this phenomenon. The fair covered over 600 acres and featured more than 200 buildings constructed in Beaux-Arts classical style, creating what was called the White City due to the building's white facades. The Central Court of Honor contained enormous structures, including the Administration Building, with a dome larger than the US Capitol, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, covering 44 acres under a single roof, making it the largest building in the world at that time, and the Agricultural Building, Machinery Hall, Electricity Building, and numerous others, each massive and elaborately decorated. Official accounts state these buildings were constructed in approximately 2 years, 1891 to 1893, using staff a mixture of plaster, cement, and fibre over wooden frames. The material was chosen because it was cheap, could be moulded into elaborate forms easily, and allowed rapid construction. The buildings were painted white to create visual unity and to hide the fact they were made of different materials. After the fair closed in October 1893, most buildings were demolished because staff deteriorates rapidly when exposed to weather, the wooden structures posed fire hazards, and maintaining the buildings permanently would be prohibitively expensive. Tartaria proponents question every aspect of this narrative. They argue the construction timeline seems impossible, building hundreds of elaborate structures in 2 years, while simultaneously installing infrastructure including electrical systems, water mains, sewers, landscaping, and transportation networks. They point to photographs showing the buildings appearing solid and permanent, with details suggesting skilled masonry rather than moulded plaster. They question why such effort would be invested in temporary structures, suggesting it would be more economical to build permanent buildings if such massive construction was necessary. They note that some fair buildings survive. The Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, is still standing and functional over 130 years later. If this building could survive, why couldn't others? They suggest the survival proves the buildings were more substantially constructed than claimed, and the demolition of others might have been necessary not because they were deteriorating, but because their existence contradicted official narratives about when and how such structures could be built. Proponents also question the demolition itself. Photographs and accounts describe fires that destroyed several buildings in the months and years after the fair. The most destructive fire occurred in July 1894, consuming several major buildings. Additional fires followed in subsequent years. Proponents find this pattern suspicious, multiple large fires destroying buildings in short succession raises questions about whether the fires were accidental or deliberate, whether they were destroying evidence of something officials wanted hidden. Contemporary accounts and official records provide detailed documentation of the fair's construction and demolition that mainstream historians argue thoroughly rebuts alternative claims. Daniel Burnham, the fair's chief architect, maintained extensive records of construction contracts, worker employment, material purchases, and construction progress. These records show clearly how the buildings were constructed: wooden framing from lumber yards in Michigan and Wisconsin, staff fabricated on site, sculpture and ornamental elements created by teams of artists and craftsmen, electrical and plumbing systems installed by contractors whose names and payments are documented. The 2-year construction timeline was achievable precisely because of industrialization and organization. Burnham employed thousands of workers, operated multiple construction sites simultaneously, used standardized techniques that allowed mass production of components, and benefited from railroad transport, delivering materials, and Chicago's position as manufacturing center, providing equipment and supplies. The construction was a triumph of project management and industrial-scale organization, not a mystery requiring alternative explanations. The buildings appeared substantial in photographs because staff over wooden frames, when well executed, does look solid. The material takes paint well, can be molded to mimic stone carving, and photographs show surface appearance, not structural composition. Expert observers who visited the fair and examined buildings closely noted they were temporary structures, but visitors viewing from normal distances saw impressive facades that served their purpose of creating spectacle. The demolition was necessitated by material deterioration and economics. Staff exposed to Chicago, weather-freezing winters, humid summers, rain and snow begins cracking and crumbling within months. The wooden frames supporting the staff were vulnerable to rot and fire. Maintaining the buildings would require constant repair and replacement, costing far more than the building's value. The land was valuable lakeshore property that the city wanted to develop. Demolition was logical, and expected contemporaries understood from the beginning that the fair was temporary. The fires that destroyed buildings were unfortunate but not mysterious. Wooden structures with electrical systems, relatively new technology, sometimes installed hastily, were fire-prone. The buildings were unoccupied or minimally maintained after the fair closed, reducing fire prevention and response. Multiple fires in abandoned wooden structures is exactly what you'd expect, not evidence of arson or cover-up. The Palace of Fine Arts survived because it was specifically constructed with more permanent materials, brick and limestone, rather than staff and wood, because it was intended from the beginning to become a permanent museum. Its survival proves the exception, demonstrating what permanent construction required, and making clear why temporary structures were used for most buildings where permanence wasn't intended. Similar patterns appear in other World's Fairs: the 1889 Paris Exposition, 1904 Street, Louisiana Purchase Exposition, 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, and others. All featured elaborate temporary buildings, most demolished after the fairs, a few surviving as permanent structures. The pattern is consistent with the fair's purpose, creating temporary spectacle that showcased participating nations and industries' achievements without the expense of permanent construction. But proponents note the pattern also means hundreds of magnificent buildings were built and destroyed within spans of decades across multiple continents. They see something wasteful, suspicious, or inexplicable in this cycle of construction and demolition. They ask whether societies would really invest such enormous resources in temporary structures, or whether the temporary explanation serves to justify the removal of buildings that were actually older, permanent, and architecturally significant in ways that contradicted official narratives about who built them and when. The debate over World's Fair architecture ultimately centers on the same interpretive divide that characterizes Tartaria debates generally. Mainstream historians see well-documented construction and demolition driven by practical considerations: cost, material properties, intended use, land value. Proponents see patterns requiring different explanation: too much sophistication for temporary structures, too much effort for brief use, too convenient that buildings were demolished before they could be fully examined and their construction techniques fully understood. Contemporary documentation is extensive enough that mainstream historians consider the question settled: the buildings were temporary, built as documented, demolished for documented reasons. But documentation can be questioned, motives can be attributed to record keepers, and patterns can be interpreted different ways. For those predisposed to see conspiracy or hidden history, the World's Fairs provide visually spectacular evidence that something doesn't add up, that the official story doesn't adequately explain why such magnificence was created and destroyed so readily. For those accepting conventional history, the fairs demonstrate industrial society's capability for massive organized construction and its willingness to create expensive spectacle for specific purposes, without requiring that spectacle to outlast its usefulness. The technology question. Beyond architecture, Tartaria proponents point to technologies that allegedly appeared too suddenly or too widely distributed in the 19th century, suggesting either inheritance from earlier advanced civilizations or suppression of advanced capabilities that mainstream history doesn't acknowledge. These claims center on electrical systems, atmospheric energy collection, and infrastructure that proponents argue was more sophisticated than conventional development timelines allow. The old buildings that feature elaborate metal domes, spires, and ornamental metalwork are interpreted by some proponents as components of atmospheric electricity collection systems. They argue these features copper domes that are electrically conductive, metal spires and finials that could function as antennas, networks of metal ornamentation connected through building structures were designed to collect ambient electrical energy from the atmosphere or telluric currents from Earth itself, providing power before petroleum-based systems became dominant. Proponents point to historical texts describing experiments with atmospheric electricity. Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment demonstrated electricity in the atmosphere. Later, researchers including Nikola Tesla experimented with wireless power transmission and atmospheric energy. Patents from the late 1800s and early 1900s describe devices for collecting atmospheric electricity. Some old buildings have architectural features that seem unnecessarily elaborate unless they served functions beyond decoration. The conventional explanation is that while atmospheric electricity experiments occurred, they never developed into practical power sources. The energy available is intermittent, unreliable, and insufficient for powering buildings. Tesla's wireless power experiments, while genuine, didn't achieve commercially viable results. Buildings had metal ornamentation for aesthetic reasons. Copper domes were prestigious and didn't require painting, and for practical purposes, like lightning protection, and weatherproofing. The electrical systems documented in late 19th century buildings used conventional power sources, generators, batteries, and eventually grid power from coal or hydroelectric plants. Archives contain extensive records of electrical companies installing systems, cities building power plants, utility companies developing distribution networks. The transition from gas lighting to electric lighting in the 1880s-1900s is thoroughly documented with business records, patent applications, newspaper accounts, and municipal archives showing exactly how cities were electrified. Proponents respond that perhaps the documentation describes the re-implementation of electrical systems after disruption, that the rapid global deployment of electricity suggests infrastructure already existed and was being restored rather than built from scratch. But this requires explaining why no earlier electrical infrastructure appears in records before the 1870s, 1880s, why the technology is described as revolutionary and new in contemporary accounts, and why inventors and businessmen involved in electrical development are documented discovering and refining techniques rather than recovering and re-implementing older knowledge. Telegraph and telephone networks present similar questions. These communication technologies appeared and spread rapidly in the mid to late 1800s. Telegraph networks spanning continents and oceans were functioning by the 1860s. Telephone systems were deployed across major cities by the 1890s. Proponents question whether this pace was realistic without pre-existing infrastructure or inherited knowledge. Historical records document the deployment in extensive detail. Telegraph companies' expansion is tracked in business records, government contracts, newspaper accounts, and maps showing network growth. The laying of transatlantic cables is documented with engineering specifications, ship logs recording cable laying operations, and newspaper reports celebrating the achievement. Telephone deployment is similarly documented with patent records, Alexander Graham Bell's patents, business records of telephone companies, municipal permissions for installing poles and wires, and directories listing subscribers. The pace was rapid because the technologies had obvious commercial and strategic value. Companies competed aggressively to install systems and capture market share. Governments subsidized telegraph systems for military and administrative communication. The infrastructure required poles, wires, switches, operators was relatively simple compared to later technologies, allowing rapid deployment once the basic techniques were established. This is normal technology diffusion driven by competition and profit motive, not evidence of pre-existing systems being restored. The infrastructure itself raises questions for proponents. Photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s often show cities with extensive networks of overhead wires, telegraph, telephone, electrical power, creating dense tangles of cables on poles lining streets. Proponents note this infrastructure appears suddenly in a period of decades, question whether such rapid deployment was realistic, and sometimes suggest the infrastructure already existed, and photographs simply document it becoming visible in public consciousness. But the infrastructure's growth is documented year by year. Photographs from the 1870s show minimal wiring. Photographs from 1880s show increasing density. Photographs from 1890s, 1900s show the characteristic dense tangles before underground conduits became common. The progression is clear and matches documented deployment timelines. Contemporary accounts describe the overhead wires as new, sometimes as unsightly problems that needed regulation, reflecting public adjustment to new technology rather than rediscovery of old infrastructure. Transportation infrastructure, railroad networks, trolley systems, subway systems shows similar patterns. These appeared and expanded rapidly in the 19th century, creating global transportation networks within decades. Proponents sometimes question whether such massive construction projects were achievable in the timeframes claimed. Mainstream history points to documented construction, engineering records, financial records showing capital investment, newspaper accounts tracking progress, and the massive economic and strategic incentives that drove rapid railroad construction. The technology question ultimately asks whether the pace of 19th century technological change was natural and explainable through documented factors: industrialization, capitalism, competition, strategic incentives, or whether it requires additional explanation: inheritance from earlier civilizations, recovery of suppressed technology, or re-implementation of disrupted system. The abundance of contemporary documentation describing development, deployment, and business operations supports the conventional explanation, but proponents question whether documentation can be trusted when the patterns seem inconsistent with how they believe technology should develop. This reflects broader disagreement about technological progress, whether it proceeds linearly from simple to complex, whether it can be disrupted and lost requiring rediscovery, whether documentation of technology deployment necessarily proves the technology was newly developed rather than newly implemented. Mainstream history assumes technological development is cumulative and documented, that we can trust the historical record of invention and deployment. Alternative researchers question these assumptions, seeing patterns that suggest cyclical rather than linear development, suppressed rather than merely undeveloped technologies, and documentation that may describe surface appearances while concealing deeper realities about technological origins and capabilities. The resolution that won't come. The Tartaria controversy is unlikely to be definitively resolved because it involves fundamentally different approaches to historical evidence, different levels of trust in institutional authority, and different assumptions about how history works and how knowledge about the past is constructed and transmitted. The debate has all the characteristics of what some scholars call essentially contested concepts disagreements that persist not because evidence is insufficient, but because the frameworks for interpreting evidence are incommensurable. For mainstream historians, Tartaria claims are easily dismissed because they contradict extensive documentation, lack supporting evidence from contemporary sources, and require conspiracy theories of implausible scale. The maps showing Tartaria are explained through cartographic history. The architecture is explained through documented 19th century construction. The alleged mud flood is contradicted by geological evidence and absence of contemporary accounts. The technologies appeared when documented records say they appeared, developed by documented inventors and deployed by documented companies. Any individual anomaly or question can be addressed within conventional historical frameworks without requiring lost civilizations or historical erasure. For Tartaria proponents, mainstream explanations are inadequate because they rely on trust in institutional authority and documentation that could itself be part of historical revision. Maps consistently showing a place for centuries can't be dismissed as mere terminology. Buildings appearing too sophisticated for their supposed construction dates and locations suggest something amiss. The patterns are too consistent, too global, too anomalous to be explained away by conventional development. The absence of contemporary documentation describing Tartaria, as proponents understand it, might prove not that Tartaria didn't exist, but that documentation was suppressed, or that the civilization's true nature wasn't recognized or recorded accurately by observers. The interpretive impasse exists because both sides can accommodate evidence within their frameworks. Mainstream historians accommodate anomalies through specialized knowledge understanding cartographic evolution, architectural history, urban planning practices, photographic technology that explains observations without requiring alternative civilizations. Proponents accommodate mainstream evidence by questioning its reliability. Documentation could be forged, incomplete, or created as cover story, and by noting that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that lack of Tartarian artifacts might result from deliberate removal rather than proving nothing existed to be removed. Neither position can definitively prove its case because historical knowledge is always inferential and incomplete. We cannot observe the past directly. We can only examine surviving evidence and construct narratives that explain it. When different narratives both explain available evidence, even if one requires fewer assumptions or additional unproven factors, choosing between them becomes partly empirical, but also partly based on prior commitments about evidentiary standards, institutional trust, and philosophical assumptions about historical processes. The question of whether new evidence could resolve the debate is itself contested. Mainstream historians would be convinced by clear contemporary documentation describing Tartaria as unified civilization, by archaeological discoveries of distinctively Tartarian artifacts and structures, by inscriptions or texts in Tartarian language describing its history and culture, or by some form of evidence that couldn't be explained as misidentification or misattribution of known civilizations' remains. But proponents might argue such evidence doesn't exist because it was destroyed or is suppressed, that what would convince mainstream historians has been deliberately removed, and the absence of such evidence proves the suppression rather than proving Tartaria didn't exist. This creates unfalsifiable position. Any evidence that would disprove the theory could be explained as having been removed. An absence of evidence becomes evidence of cover-up rather than evidence the phenomenon doesn't exist. Conversely, mainstream historians argue proponents interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm their beliefs while dismissing contrary evidence. Buildings with features proponents find anomalous become Tartarian. Buildings with identical features that fit conventional narratives are ignored. Maps showing Tartaria are emphasized. Maps from the same periods using different terminology or showing the region as divided among known entities are dismissed. Photographs that seem to show advanced development are highlighted. Contemporary documents describing construction of that development are questioned. This selective attention to confirming evidence while dismissing contrary evidence is classic confirmation bias. The social and cultural functions the Tartaria narrative serves complicate resolution further. For some proponents, Tartaria provides explanatory framework that makes sense of modern society's problems if we lost advanced civilization, if knowledge was suppressed, if institutions lie about history, then contemporary difficulties might result from departing from better ways that existed before, rather than from failing to progress far enough. This narrative serves psychological and social needs beyond historical accuracy. The community aspect also matters. Tartaria research connects people, provides identity, creates shared purpose. Resolving the debate definitively in ways that invalidate core claims would disrupt these social functions, creating disincentives to accepting resolution even if strong evidence emerged. Similarly, mainstream academics have professional and institutional incentives to maintain established narratives. Admitting major historical revision would require acknowledging errors, revising textbooks, rethinking established positions. Neither side is purely neutral evaluator of evidence. The debate also exists within broader cultural context of declining trust in institutions, growing skepticism of official narratives, and proliferation of alternative explanations facilitated by internet communication. Tartaria theories resonate with people who have lost faith in mainstream sources and who seek alternative explanations for phenomena official sources don't adequately address. The theory persists partly because it fulfills these needs, regardless of evidentiary strength. Whether Tartaria represents genuine hidden history or elaborate construction built on misinterpretation may ultimately matter less than understanding what the debate reveals about how historical knowledge functions in contemporary society, how we evaluate evidence, whom we trust, what we're willing to believe, and how we navigate uncertainty when dealing with the fragmentary, contested, and always somewhat ambiguous record of human past. The debate continues because both positions offer coherent frameworks, because evidence can be interpreted multiple ways, and because the question touches values and commitments extending far beyond the specific historical claims about maps, buildings, and civilizations that may or may not have existed in Central Asia and beyond.